So why is trans media representation important? And I looked at and there's been a couple of studies in this. So this is coming from the Trans Mental Health Survey of 2012. And there's an overwhelming, like 92% of people have heard that being trans is not normal. And you have extremely high suicide rates, extremely high levels of harassment and intimidation from friends, family, the police, in workplaces, and people having to change their behaviour because of that. So say, have to move away from home and move away from family and friends to, start a life somewhere else and try and avoid that kind of history with other people. The Trans Media Watch survey actually looked at the effect of poor media representation. So lots of people feel that seeing negative items in the press make them feel angry and unhappy and excluded and frightened. And I think that's something that's really important to challenge, because because it's simply not right that someone is feeling excluded and frightened and living in fear because of negative media representation. Again, people experience these reactions from so many people in their lives. I mean, this isn't just what strangers in the street say to you. This is stuff that their family or their friends are coming up with. And you get everything from verbal abuse, and also around 10% of people have experienced physical abuse, which they believe is accountable to poor media representation. So this isn't just kind of an academic interest. This is something that has a real effect on people's lives and happiness and their ability to partake in society. Again, people's negative reactions at work, so that's a direct influence on things like earning, but also that's going to affect where can you live, where can you live with your support network. I was talking to Ruth earlier that there's a huge problem in London because rents are so high, and if you're not earning something there, you can't afford to live there, and if all of your support structures are there, then that means that you can end up being very isolated. Again, negative reactions from service providers such as the NHS. This doesn't necessarily mean like a gender identity clinic, but this can be going to your GP and saying, I've got a flu or something, or I've got this allergic reaction to my soap or something, and then bringing up your trans identity, which is going to then impact people accessing this service, even though they, really do need it. They need to see a doctor, but can't because their doctor's not going to treat them as an equal. And then you get some 5% report ongoing family problems and breakdowns. So again, that's the loss of a support structure. That's the loss of someone's really close family, their siblings, their parents, people that they've grown up with. And that's a tremendous loss, and again contributes to mental health problems and feelings of isolation. So, as I said, it's not just an academic interest, it's something that has this huge effect on people's lives. So, Trans Media Watch did contribute to the Leveson inquiry, which was a report into media reporting practices. And one of the things that was identified was this very poor reporting of trans issues. And the Trans Media Watch made one oral submission and two written submissions. So they made a submission in December 2011 called The British Press and the Transgender Community. They then made an additional submission a few months later in February 2012, and then Helen Belcher made an oral submission in February 2012 as well. So they identified two aspects of poor media representation. So while there were kind of singling individual trans people for sustained personal intrusion, if you were being reported in the press, then you were going to get this very intrusive media response. But they also identified that poor media representation contributed to a general climate of ridicule and humiliation. And they identified 4 strategies that were being used. So routine use of previous names, use of before photos, and this extends all the way to children. When I was doing another talk, I was looking for kind of examples that I could offer, and it was actually really disturbing just how many children were kind of being intruded on. I mean, I'm not saying this is acceptable for an adult, but there was something particularly upsetting about a 6-year-old's photos kind of being sifted through and hauled into the kind of the public light. Demeaning and intimidating language for comic effect. So there's this kind of, oh yes, being trans is a bit as a joke. Let's use some really upsetting language to reinforce that. And then just misgendering on all levels. So as well as previous names, use of the wrong pronouns, use of kind of physical attributes, and so on. So this is what Transmedia Watch identified, and what I'm going to argue is that it's actually a bit more subtle than that, and the press are they're kind of using these things in a slightly different way, and in a way that kind of deflects some of their responsibility, and I'll be discussing how they do that. So the particular case I focus on is that of Lucy Meadows, who was a primary school teacher whose transition was reported in the school newsletter in December 2012, and she was found dead at her home in March 2013. So the coroner leading the inquest into her death recorded a verdict of suicide, but condemned the media response as intrusive and sensational. So while the coroner recorded this verdict for suicide, he basically said that the media response to this in December contributed to her death by creating a climate in which she was unable to escape or function. So I collected some texts for this. So between the 31st of October, so before this appeared in the press at all, to the 31st of October 2013. So these were collected from an online database called Nexus. There were 166 texts and about 110,000 words, so quite a small corpus. And I compared this to a collection of general news texts. So again, this was taken from the UK newspapers and UK broadsheet section of an online database. There's about 7,000 articles and about 4 million words in this, and these were taken from the same period that the Lucy Meadows texts were taken from. There's a distinct timeline that emerges. So Meadows' transition was reported in December and a little bit in March. Her death was reported in March. The media response was reported from March to kind of late June. Her reports about the remembrance ceremonies were reported in April and May. However, then you get this kind of reports of other trans women being reported in the context of her life and death. And this starts from about early April and goes all the way until October. You then get the coroner's inquest being reported in quite an intense burst in May, and then the coroner was publicly rebuked in August. And again, there's quite an intense burst of a few articles over kind of a few days there.
The coroner was criticised?
Yeah, the coroner was criticised for making comments about the press intrusion into her life.
By who?
I think that was actually a news response. So this was the newspapers that had been criticised then turned on the coroner and said, you shouldn't have said that. We didn't do anything. We didn't have anything to do with her death. Which was, yes, you can have a look. I'm happy to let anyone see the articles that these were taken from afterwards. So what I did is I calculated these things called keywords, and what keywords do is they show what was more frequent in this target corpus, this small one of Lucy Meadows' death, than in this larger corpus. So basically, if these words are more frequent than we'd expect, then they show up. So things like the, for example, a, the, to, are going to appear in similar frequencies in both collections of texts, so those won't be highlighted. But what I did do is collect the words that were much more frequent than I'd expect in Lucy Meadows' articles than in this larger, in the general news corpus. So you can see the calculation there, and I'd be happy to explain it later, but statistics. Everyone's probably going to look a bit upset. My undergraduate certainly did. So anyway, so this is the first 28 keywords, and you can see that most of these are content words directly to do with the reporting. So you have things like Meadows, teacher, transgender, Lucy, school, primary, because she taught in a primary school, Accrington, which is the area she lived, coroner, teachers, inquest, and then you also get Lucy Meadows' previous name. However, what I was interested in is that you get these two female pronouns. So you get her at number 20 and you get she at number 22. So it's quite significant that pronouns are coming up as significantly more frequent in these Lucy Meadows texts than in the general news corpus. So I was interested in who these pronouns refer to. So we have 837 occurrences of her, and of these, about 80% refer to Lucy Meadows herself, about 13% of these refer to other trans women, and about 6% refer to cis women. So there's this kind of overwhelming use of female pronouns to refer to trans women and Meadows herself. When I looked at she, we see a fairly similar pattern, that 63% of the 748 occurrences refer to Meadows, about 21.5% refer to other trans women, and about 15.5% refer to cis women. So what's happening here? What seems to be happening is that when she is used for Lucy Meadows, you have these really frequent occurrences of she had, she was, and you get lots and lots of communication verbs. So things like she added, announced, complained, complains, described, informed, insisted, said, spoke, talks, told, wrote. And these make up nearly 20% of the occurrences of she when referring to Meadows. So she's doing lots of talking, she's doing lots of describing from kind of her perceptions and feelings and experiences. You get a fairly similar pattern in she referring to other trans women. In these cases, the communication verbs make up about 40%. And again, you have the she had, she has, she was patterns. Again, she was, for cis women, there's kind of about 11 occurrences of that, and communication verbs, again, make up nearly 60% of these occurrences. So women are talking about their experiences, they're talking about how they feel, what they experience, how they perceive things. When we look at male pronouns, of these, there's a significant, in most cases, minority referring to Lucy Meadows herself. So he, about 32%, him, about 54%, and his, about 47%, referring to Meadows rather than to other men. Well, referring to men. Again, you get some of these verbal processes, but these make up about 13% of he. So the women are talking about their experiences, perceptions, when Meadows is referred to as male, and other men are not being referred to in terms of what they said or added or announced. So what's actually happening when Meadows is referred to as she. And then what's happening when she's referred to as a he? And you have this really, really clear usage based on whether it was before or after her death. In fact, when I calculated this, I kind of ran around going like, oh my God, this is so blatant. Because before her death, it's about three quarters of the occurrences of he are used before death, about a quarter is used after death. However, after Meadows' death, it completely reverses. About kind of 95% of the occurrences of she are used after death, and only 5% of occurrences of she are used before death. So while Meadows was alive, the press was overwhelmingly using male pronouns to refer to her. Overwhelmingly. However, after her death is when there's this quite abrupt reversal, and that's when they suddenly start referring to her in terms of female pronouns. They can respect her gender identity after she's died, but not while she is alive. So then, when is he used? And you do get these examples of tabloid misgendering. So here are some examples. So Upton says he always knew he was born when he began growing his cropped hair. If he cares so little, he decided to go public as he got older. He has taught, he is paid to teach, he issued a statement, he married and fathered a child. So you get these kind of tabloid misgendering occurrences. You get repeated occurrences. So when he announced his plans is actually found in 6 different articles. But interestingly, you get these direct quotations. So of the 124 occurrences of he that happened before Meadows' death, 65 of them are due to direct quotations, and 10 of the 38 occurrences after her death are, again, direct quotations. You also get some indirect quotations. So indirect quotations might be, he felt he had been born, says he. So this is when the press are attributing a subject position. But while there are some problematic pronoun choices here, the problem mainly seems to be who is quoted. And this is coming from the direct quotations. So things like, he is a lovely person. If he was a rubbish teacher, he is still Mr. Upton, but in a dress. And you get these really direct quotations from, in this case, her in-laws and parents at the school. But you also get this repetition across many different texts. So in this case, this is six quotes of the same child saying he spoke to us, but it's reported in several different articles in several different papers. Again, as he got older, is found in 6 articles. So if you're reading all of these articles, that's going to be kind of this constant kind of dripping of wrong pronouns. Then we have Richard Littlejohn, who kind of waded in with an article announcing he's not only in the wrong body, he's in the wrong job. Instead of this just coming up a couple of times, there are actually 33 occurrences of this in quite a small corpus. And when I looked at it, it looks a bit like this. And I don't know how clearly you can see, but it is just the wrong body, he's in the wrong job, right down the page. So what's actually happening here? Is this because this article is being printed in different newspapers? And actually, it wasn't so much that it was reproduced, but it was also due to meta-commentary from other press reporters. So they were actually reporting that Littlejohn had written this article, and even if they were framing it as this was inappropriate and upsetting and offensive, they were still reproducing his words and his mispronouncing. So so even if they were condemning it, it was still present, it was still being used, and if you were reading these articles, it was still, even though they were condemning it, there's still this sense of it was something newsworthy, it was something worth reporting and talking about and reproducing, which I found quite problematic because it's still giving Little John a platform and it's still using his words and in a way deeming that newsworthy. It kind of suggests maybe he's got a point, maybe this is something that we should be talking about and addressing as if it's something to take seriously rather than the ravings of Richard Littlejohn. So basically, to sum up, there were different pronoun choices, and these were really marked both before and after death, and also in who the press decided to whose words they decided to report and how many times. So before her death, the dominant pronoun being used was he. After her death, the dominant pronoun being used was she, and you do get this kind of really dramatic switch between them. He was being used in direct quotes. So this is where I think that the news response was doing something quite clever. They weren't kind of using he themselves so much as they were selectively deciding who they should quote, whose quotation should be published, whose words were going to be reproduced across several articles. So then if you try and kind of catch them on that, if you're saying you're using the wrong pronouns, this is unacceptable, it would be, oh no, we're not using the wrong pronouns, we're just quoting people, we're giving the parents of these children, we're giving the children themselves, we're giving people in that community a platform, we're using their words, we're not doing it ourselves. But there's always a choice in whose voices they broadcast and who they give a platform to. And then there was this recycling of quotes. So if someone came out with kind of quite a nice soundbite, that wasn't just being used in one article, that was being used across several, and indeed several articles across different times. And they also might kind of pop up later. So one of the things I noticed was that some of the children were quoted at the time of Lucy Meadows and making her announcement and saying that she was going to return to the school after the Christmas break, and that's when they reported something then. But then they recycled that quote later on, so several months later the same quote was popping up again. So it was kind of like once this had been announced, once this had been published, it wasn't going to disappear. It was going to be recycled, reused, used as a soundbite, and also spread across different papers. So it might have come up in the local paper at first, but then, say, the Daily Mail would have kind of used that quote for their press content. And then there was also this idea of this meta-commentary that was going on. So the press wasn't just reporting on the actual events that were happening, they were also reporting what other reporters had said. So particularly when Little John's article came out, lots and lots of people suddenly went, and then this happened. And in doing so, they were reproducing some of his text, and they were making this, Little John's article was originally published in the Daily Mail, but what you had is that his article was then disseminated throughout other media outputs, so say in The Guardian, in The Telegraph, and so on. So people who wouldn't have read the Daily Mail were still kind of coming across his article, coming across his use of language and his use of pronouns. And there's something that I think is worth exploring there, just in, you can say something very, hurtful and damaging in one platform, but then this gets picked up, and then people who wouldn't normally pick up the Daily Mail are still being exposed to this kind of low-level transphobia, well, not really low level, but they're being exposed to it in contexts that they wouldn't normally be exposed to. So, I think that Transmedia Watch are doing a fantastic job. Their submissions to the Leveson inquiry were really in-depth, really thoughtful, but there's also this idea that the media are a little bit more savvy than I think they're giving them credit for, that the media are using some quite interesting tactics to evade responsibility. So they aren't the ones saying, we think that, we think that there's a problem here. Instead, it's very much about who they're quoting, who they're giving a voice to. To contextualize it in this seminar, it's kind of indicative of the problems with fluidity and about talking with it outside a group like this where we kind of understand that gender is complicated. And it's reinforcing this idea that transition is problematic, it's not going to be respected. And I think there's something that's really worth tackling about media representation, simply because it informs so many people. It doesn't just inform your kind of teenager questioning their gender identity. It informs people's families and friends and communities. It informs people who might just kind of come into contact with trans people through their work. So say the person who's working in the bank that you're trying to deposit a check and questions your title. It informs the person at the GP clinic. It informs the person who serves you in a restaurant. And I think there's something that's really important to talk about this in the context of just informing a wider community who might not realise that they're coming into contact with trans people, but who still are going to be, and who need to know something about just kind of basic respect and allowing that person to participate in society. Okay, so I think that is my last slide. So if anyone has any questions, either on the topic, the methodology, the approach, or media representation in general, please do ask.